Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I want to, again, thank you for being here. This is a small group so far. Hopefully some others will join us, but we'll see. I want to welcome you to a community conversation tonight to discuss some proposed zoning and site plan review regulation updates for downtown Lebanon. If you haven't already signed in, please do so. We want to be able to make sure that you all stay informed about this effort as it moves forward. So, my name is David Brooks. I'm the planning director for the city, and just to sort of set the stage before I turn it over to our consultants, the regulations that we'll be talking about tonight are another step in the city's effort to implement the downtown visioning study. As hopefully many of you know, that study was completed in 2016. It involved a lot of community consensus and a lot of public input and public participation. So, broadly speaking, the visioning study had a lot of recommendations over an extended period of time. But one of them was that we update some of the development regulations that apply to downtown specifically. It noted that the regulations that are in place right now already allow for a good mix of the kinds of development that the community expressed support for. But it also recommended that we make some targeted improvements and modify certain regulations and consider adopting some design regulations so that all of the buildings that come in the future will benefit and contribute to the positive atmosphere and the positive downtown that we're trying to achieve. So to implement those recommendations, the city hired Goody Clancy, who's here tonight, two representatives, Kathleen Onifer and Ben Carlson, and they're in the back, and they'll be coming up in a moment, to help us turn the recommendations and the guidelines of the visioning study into regulations for the city to again achieve the kind of development that we'd like to see. As many of you know, the downtown, the existing central business regulations are in place to provide in-town areas for retail and service businesses like banks, offices, government buildings, and other supporting commercial and high-density housing, high-density residential uses. What these proposed new regulations are intended to do is to build on that by specifically promoting an active pedestrian environment, which is consistent with what we heard through the visioning study, to build on the character of the district that we already have in order to promote the environment that's safe, appealing, and attractive for downtown. So the purpose of tonight's community conversation is to present the concepts to you, answer any questions, get your feedback. At the end of the meeting, at the end of the conversation, we'll talk about what the next steps will be as this continues to move forward. Just one thing to clarify, it was sort of referenced in the newspaper article. The regulations that we're talking about tonight are intended to apply to downtown Lebanon only at the moment. We'd like to do similar planning for West Lebanon, but we think we need a visioning study for that area so that we have the kind of community input needed to know what that community wants to see for that area of town. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kathleen and Ben to walk us through the proposed regulations for tonight and help answer questions. So.
Thanks. And I'll start by briefly sharing some of the specifics from the visioning study that David was speaking about, and Kathleen will get into the more specific recommendations we have before us. So one of the products of the vision plan was what we call an urban design framework. What does that mean? Well, urban design is sort of the character that we get in a place in a downtown like this. It's really a mix of the private development sites and the businesses and all the uses that are happening on different sites, and the qualities of Colburn Park, of streets. of the riverfront, of the public spaces that supported downtown. And so we're thinking about how those elements work together. In framework, the plan is not prescriptive. The great thing about a downtown like this is there's lots of opportunity over time for individual businesses and property owners and residents, artists, to bring their great idea to downtown in terms of what they want to do. And we want to have a very flexible framework that allows people to do that. At the same time, we have a lot of people and properties up against each other, and so we do need to sort of organize that in a predictable way, and that's what the design guidelines are all about. Key concepts that came out of the framework. Some of these are about public spaces, creating a downtown arts walk, linking the Arts Center to the river. Welcome people downtown with a Hanover Street gateway, an entrance over here that's more attractive than what we have today. Complete the Muskoma River Greenway, make it easier to experience the riverside. And some of these are very much related to development sites, existing properties, and possibly new development or changes to properties that might come in. So it talks about mixed use and infill development that enhances the vibrancy of downtown. So how does ongoing reinvestment in property and changes to properties as that happen, how do they make downtown a better place? And again, how do our gateways to downtown shift a little bit from some of the more automobile-oriented gateways, the parking lots, to places that feel more welcoming to people. And connect downtown in the neighborhoods. A terrific aspect of Lebanon is you have a lot of residential neighborhoods close by, within an easy walking distance. And while many of those street connections and sidewalk connections are there, some of the streets are a little hard to cross, they're a little busy, and so we want to make some of those connections work better. These recommendations came from a variety of conversations, some of them like this one, a smaller focus group of stakeholders, property owners, some of them quite large in terms of broader visioning sessions, and you probably attended some of those, sharing ideas, concerns, suggestions that were built into this. And there were online surveys as well. So there's really been a great deal of community input reflected in these recommendations. There's also a lot of specific attention to different parts of the downtown study area. Lots of different types of places are represented here, from the Colburn Park and the sort of iconic conditions around there, to Hanover Street coming in to the north, which has a wide variety of different buildings and activities, to Spencer Street, which it also has a mix. It doesn't have sidewalks today, doesn't quite fit in with the downtown street network, but could, as well as Bank Street and other streets that have beautiful historic homes that are distinct from what you see around Main Street. So lots of different conditions. Some sites shown in yellow that could offer redevelopment opportunities. Lots of other sites that we'd like to preserve or that are not likely to change. So when we get down to design guidelines, as we were talking about those today, there are a few different ways we're distinguishing those across the study area. Some of the recommendations or rules are around streets. Places like right here, North Park Street, the pedestrian mall, places where you have traditional storefronts, where you've had shops for many years, where you have lots of windows right on the sidewalk. We want to reinforce that. So if somebody is rebuilding a building or changing a building, we want to continue the presence of retail or other active uses in those places. There are other locations that might make a lot more sense for residential or an office building or other uses, and so those are secondary streets. There's much more flexibility around use, but there's a consistency of a goal of making those streets walkable, making them connect to the neighborhoods around us. There are approaches to facades that really apply to just about any building that help make sure that wherever you are in different streets, you have attractive buildings and ones that help make the street feel safe because they do have windows facing the sidewalk. And finally, parking. Parking is a necessary resource downtown. But big parking lots like this one, that's a sketch of the area off of Hanover Street, aren't all that inviting for walking for some of the qualities we're trying to go for. So, looking at opportunities to place that parking next to buildings or behind buildings so that they don't dominate the areas of downtown. The parking needs to be nearby. It needs to be convenient for businesses and for residents, but it doesn't always need to be right in front. So that's sort of the broader frame for the different types of regulations we'll be talking about.
All right. So that was sort of the set of recommendations that were in that downtown visioning plan, setting those broad goals, a sense of what we were trying to move towards. And then when this effort really does is then say, how do we implement that by writing that into regulation, by really specifically looking at both the zoning regulations and the site plan regulations to make sure whether you are a property owner, a neighbor of a property owner in the downtown, a general community member, the staff, a developer, the planning board and city council as they review items coming before, that everyone's really has clear expectations and guidelines of how we're sort of going to achieve that vision and how they will be applied to property. And so one of the things we also want to highlight here is in putting this together, we've been working with city staff over the course of almost a year, intermittently, really looking at projects that have come in over the last year, how they would fit under these regulations or how these regulations would affect them to make sure they're appropriate and that it's aligned with other changes the staff is making. I see some familiar faces from when we were here in April and got some really great feedback from property owners, architects, and designers, and the planning board really walking through these recommendations in detail. And so I'm going to try and highlight for you where we've made some changes and adjustments based on the feedback we heard there. And then I know many of you are here tonight because you were invited through the mailing to downtown property owners and the material that's been available on the website. To make sure that folks are understanding. So as we've been talking about the CBD district, this is a map of the current zoning of where the current CBD district is applied here. And as David mentioned, this is an effort that is envisioning replacing the CBD zoning with a downtown-specific zoning district that would be a new district. And that moving through a visioning study and then through implementation for West Lebanon would proceed to make sure that was tailored to that area. One question we got is, okay, so just for the zoning, right? When do these changes apply? And that's really an important thing is understanding these thresholds. So new buildings, when someone constructs a new building or reconstructs existing building, you're going to need to get a letter of zoning compliance so you go through the zoning process with the staff. If your project triggers site plan review, you're going to go through zoning compliance with the staff. And all that is to say, and this is a point I'll keep reiterating because it's really important to a historic downtown and a really heterogeneous downtown like Lebanon where there's such a wide variety of uses that have been thriving here for so long, is that existing buildings have non-conforming rights that apply to both uses and to features of that building. And those continue to be a part of the process with these new regulations in place because we want those to continue to thrive. Both Ben and David spoke to this question around purpose, and what we are really going to try and highlight is where these recommendations are doing, sort of trying to create that character that helps promote a safer walking environment. So that's looking really carefully at front yards and setbacks, how we make space for sidewalks where there aren't, or how we make that sidewalk environment more inviting in terms of buffers where it's there. Looking at where curb cuts happen to that end, and also really making sure that we're paying close attention to how there's buffers and transitions from the downtown to surrounding properties and neighborhoods so that we're getting the ability to walk to downtown, but people also don't feel walled off or inappropriate there. So there is a handout that walks through in very careful, sort of legally approved detail what uses would be changing in this area for the new district. So the sort of big picture, right, message that David reiterated is that this is really allowing for a very wide range of uses, largely reflective of the uses that are both in the district and are currently permitted to be constructed newly in the district. What it does do is eliminate some of the uses that are not currently in the district and that are relatively auto-oriented. And so take large areas of parking lots or curb cut areas that don't reflect that pedestrian character we established in the vision. So that would include things like drive-throughs, vehicular sales, and funeral homes where you need a large staging area for that. We also worked with staff to sort of carefully weigh what should move into that conditional use category and make sure that was a regimented process compared to right now it's divided into a special permit process and a conditional use process so that it's clear when you're moving into the conditional use process for those uses. And then to reiterate my point again there, of course, existing uses have non-conforming rights, and so they continue to be grandfathered into the district going forward. Any questions on the uses, just because I know that can be, it's a big question. Great. I'm going to try and pause periodically if sort of things are coming up as I walk through, but also I will not be offended if no one has questions about zoning. I fully admit that most people don't get as into setbacks as I do. So a thing that's related to uses, right, is that we've really focused on what happens on the ground floor of a building, both in terms of form and in specific locations uses. And the model for this is really thinking about the downtown mall, right, which has the traditional storefront construction with other uses located above. And what we've then gone and identified on a map is very limited locations where we would want to ensure that a property is including commercial uses for at least part of a building if it's a new building or another one of the additions or changes of use that's going to trigger zoning compliance. Yes?
You do realize that's in the historic district, right?
The downtown mall.
Yeah.
Correct.
And so any change to the buildings would have to be approved by the Heritage Commission.
Yes. So,
and we wanted to stay more or less like it is.
Correct. So this would be this would largely apply in that district if someone were to build a new building on the parking lots surrounding the downtown mall. And I'm going to skip ahead and then come back to this. So that essentially this hatch shading area. And then the Hanover Street frontage, if someone were to build...
We're not talking about on the mall at all.
So on the mall, if someone were to come to the staff before they got to the Historic Commission saying, my storefront's been empty and I want to convert the ground floor to a residential use, the staff would have the standing before even bringing it to the Historic Commission with this rule in place to say, no. On the downtown mall, we're requiring ground floor commercial use in keeping with the existing pattern that's there and the vernacular style of the architecture, the traditional style of the architecture there.
So just to clarify...
Change the storefront.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Not really coming to our commission.
I don't remember.
Right. But
She's not talking about changing the look of the storefront, but uses right now.
I see.
So someone theoretically could put up interior to the storefront, like a privacy wall or screening, and try and create it into a residential space. And what this rule says is just putting into place what is already in place in terms of the traditional building of the downtown mall as rules. And the idea is to require that to be, we've tried to really keep this at a scale of size that we think is achievable and appropriate to projects in Lebanon so that we're not requiring more commercial space than a project may meet in a mixed-use environment. And so on those primary streets, so on that map I'm going to switch back to in a second where they're red, that on that ground floor to a depth of at least 20 feet, you'd have to have at least 1,000 square feet, which is a sort of small commercial space, or a third of the overall ground floor square footage be one of those permitted commercial uses in the district. So that could be retail. It could also be an office use and be appropriate there. On secondary streets, that we'd only see that applying to large projects. And so that we are sort of setting a threshold of 20,000 square feet. So if you're doing a large project on one of those streets, then you'd need to incorporate a small amount of commercial on that ground floor, engaging the street and the sidewalk there. If you're doing a smaller project on some of those streets, then you might not need to do that. And as we look at what streets are designated what, you'll see that's in part reflecting the real mixed nature of these streets here in downtown. And so one of the big changes when we, yes?
Yeah, I'm sorry I haven't been at these for quite a while, but is commercial only retail?
No.
Okay, so it can also be offices.
Correct.
But if you've got a place on Hanover Street, I think I remember a couple that are a bit decrepit. If they are going to be totally rehabbed, do they then, and they're low-income residential, if they're going to be rehabbed, do they have to find somebody to be a commercial tenant in front and give up some of the space for housing?
As long as even though it's a change in the cost of the use, it's the same use going forward, and so the use would be grandfathered. Also, when we looked carefully at those parcels, I think most of the residential on Hanover Street is under that 20,000 square foot threshold. So even if they were to sort of build another small new structure in that area, would not have to give up space for that. But this is something we, in our reviews and discussions, we've been weighing that maybe there's an option for a project on those secondary streets to go through the conditional use permit process, even if it is over 20,000 square feet, to do an all-residential project, because that could be appropriate, particularly given some of the design requirements within the site plan regulations and some of the sites within the downtown. So one of those changes made was actually taking Hanover Street, we'll do this here, from 120 down to essentially where it branches off to turn towards the core of downtown, to that sort of secondary street, so somewhere where it's only required in large projects, not required in all projects, because that is a street with a real mixed set of parcels and characters. And then just really focusing where we're really want this level of small amount of commercial on the ground floor in the areas surrounding the downtown mall and here along Colburn Park, where it reflects the traditional building pattern and what would be complementary to those there. When I gotta face that way to get that. No? And this is an image from the downtown visioning plan that was starting to think about how potentially larger scale development might infill in those places. And all that is to say, like, when we sort of look at this, right, this development that's envisioned is in that area of Primary Street, where we'd be looking for at least 1/3 of the ground floor or 1,000 square feet of that development to include one of the commercial uses there. One of the next things we did was take a close look at the dimensional requirements and the lot sizes within downtown, and whether some of the either minimum or maximum dimensions were creating problems in meeting those. And so, one thing that we did is the lot area is reduced to 3,000 square feet, which better matches some of the parcel sizes in the downtown. The lot frontage being 40 feet, again, similar small reduction to match frontage of existing lots that are there. These front yard requirements, we're going to walk through the special instances in detail. But the point we'll make here is that there is both these special instances is really thinking about what a front yard needs to look like to serve the use that's on that ground floor that's right there accessing the front yard well, and match the existing context well. Similarly, for both the side yard and the rear yard, we'll walk through the special instances, but they're largely about making sure we're providing adequate buffer where need be, where we're downtown is abutting up against the surrounding neighborhoods of downtown. Yes?
Is this proposed or existing?
This is proposed.
What is existing?
The existing is, I believe, I should have double-checked this, 5,000.
3,000 square foot floor area,
Lot area. 50 on the frontage.
There's no front yard setback currently, there's no side yard setback. The rear yard is 10 feet, except maybe amended in special instances. The current maximum building height is 55 feet.
And so what's the change?
Existing or the proposed?
This is the proposed.
So
What's changing here is the frontage requirement is going from 50 to 40. And then the option for the higher height is being added to a conditional use.
And then some of these specific instances where we're identifying an adjacency or a use that has a further requirement. So that one go there. Yeah. So the first one in really thinking of those, and this is an image from the downtown vision plan, looking at what potential development, residential development on Spencer Street might look like. And there are a couple key things I sort of want to point out in that image that we've tried to really make sure get into the regulation. And that is, making sure that we're providing space to build a sort of a curb, a gutter, and protection for a sidewalk there. In being a residential building, making sure that there's space for there to be some front yard, some landscaping, some distance between the sidewalk and those residential uses right there, and space for there to be entrances, a place to walk into your unit there. And so all of that is said when we're having residential uses constructed on the ground floor in a new building. We're proposing, rather than a no front yard requirement, that we require at least 10 feet so that there's space for those elements to occur. We also want to make sure that even with that 10 feet, there's sufficient space on streets like Spencer, where there needs to be space to build sidewalk and infrastructure, to construct those infrastructure improvements that are needed to make this the pedestrian environment that it needs to be.
I say sometimes the sidewalk may be a part of the private property.
So, Kathleen?
Yes.
Can we back up there?
Yes.
Because I actually am an interested party on Spencer Street. And the one thing that keeps coming up when I look at these pictures is that it does not appear that you have taken into account the fact that Spencer Street is largely in the floodplain. So if you go down the street a little bit, and I know that we are trying to create an active pedestrian environment, to quote David over there, we recently had to go and confront the floodplain regulations. The first floor level of my building is going to have to be 4.5 feet above grade of the road, which means that this picture right here is imaginary. You can't have those buildings right there at the street level. Those are going to be at least 2 feet higher than the street level. Floodplain will not allow this half level below grade right there anyway. It also doesn't really reflect the fact that right about the place where that turns, the road actually dips quite a bit, and it's about 1.5 feet below the base flood elevation that it is right now. So if you're trying to create this active pedestrian environment, and I've got to put, and I potentially would need to put commercial space in there, I'm looking at 56 feet of handicapped ramp to access that. And 56 feet that's the length of my entire building. That's beyond enormous. And then it's not going to be able to happen in my building. I'm redoing my building. My building is 22 feet high. By the time I add the extra 3 feet to become flood compliant, I've got 19 feet. By the time I add the first floor level of 12 feet, there ain't no roof. So I think, especially also given the fact that there are about 7 property owners or stakeholders on Spencer Street along this whole way. There's Geocon that is essentially all commercial. It's not really affecting them all that much. They're building entirely to their own commercial needs. And what they don't already own, they've got options on to own. And when they develop it, they're going to be developing it for their specific commercial use. Across the street from me is Mason Storage. It's a big storage building. They've just gotten zoning approval to add more storage in the back. They're not doing anything with that property. Emerson Gardens is a done deal. It is finished. The only property that this really is affecting is mine.
And the Public Works property. Yeah.
The Public Works property. But the Public Works property is currently owned by the city. And if the city wants to impose these restrictions on its own piece of property as a condition of sale, it is more than welcome to do that. The other concern that I have about this is Spencer Street is effectively a dead end. And so when you start, kind of changing the requirements of how the parking works, number one, I've got a building that takes up all of the frontage on the side street. So I can't do that anyway without essentially cutting my building in half and, putting a parking lot, which I get.
Yeah.
I'm not concerned about it.
Yeah.
But just even thinking, kind of in the future, again, Geocon is going to figure out something that is going to work for Geocon first. And it's not going to affect any of the other buildings except mine. And so that is of great concern because this, in this particular instance, I won't be able to park in front of the building. I've made my peace with that. It is a kinder and more beautiful way to do that. You have interested owners who are willing and interested in supporting this vision of the city. Yeah. And I think when it comes to Spencer Street, the market probably will take care of this all by itself without this layer of zoning. The only way to get in and out of Spencer Street would be to go down to Kendrick, pull around, come to Mahan Street, and then come back. There is no way, if you're not going to be pulling in directly into a property, there's no way to get in and out of there because it's a dead end.
Well, and we will get to this when we get to the restrictions on curb cuts and frontages, but if you only have one frontage, then that's where your curb cut's going to need to be. But what I'm hearing from you really clearly is that taking a closer look at requirements on commercial on Spencer Street because of the existing uses and because of the potential and the floodplain
I think you need
makes
to actually
sense.
take the floodplain into account even when you're talking about, to the left of Taylor Street.
Yeah.
All along there because that's still floodplain. And unless they remap the floodplain, everybody's going to have that same issue. And
right.
The floodplain exists from the river to the rail trail,
right.
which is all of Spencer Street is affected by this floodplain issue. So I don't know whether or not it makes sense to just exempt the floodplain from some of these requirements, but I think the floodplain really needs to figure in, prominently. And until, a month ago, you weren't allowed to have multifamily housing in the floodplain.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Good.
I live on Spencer Street in Emerson Place, apartments there, and they have an underground parking garage underneath, and that's what lifts apartments up higher. Mm-hmm. So, that may be high enough to be out of any flooding danger. So maybe they could do the same thing for residential on the other side.
I think that's the model we would anticipate on other sites around here. I think it's one of the reasons why that front yard is important also to help make that grade change possible. It's you're absolutely right. The commercial
if you're going to,
does not make any sense.
Those are, but that's not in the picture.
It's not in the
What
picture.
you just described.
Well, we shouldn't fixate too much on this.
Yeah, the picture. I will say the picture definitely.
It's on Spencer Street, isn't it?
Yes, because this is something from the downtown vision plan, and right. And so, in terms of vision and idea of what this 10-foot front yard means, is a good illustration of that. To your point, right? When we come to as an implementation set of recommendations, the nitty-gritty of what that...
The practicality of putting in 56 feet of handicap ramp that's going to accommodate a street-facing commercial space, because the commercial space is what requires
right.
the ramp.
So it definitely, what I'm hearing is that our comment on the larger projects, looking carefully at whether Spencer is something that needs to be in the secondary street frontage or not for commercial space, is that no, from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, I just don't understand. It's a spur anyway, and there are other ways to accommodate these particular things. And as I say, the market is largely going to take care of these particular issues on Spencer Street anyway.
Right.
And so I'm not entirely sure that it needs to be or is appropriate
to be designated
appropriate to be included in these changes.
Or there may be instruments that offer an in-between, so where it is appropriate, and that's what we've been talking about. We may not get into that nitty-gritty as Kathleen referred to tonight, but I would feel alleviated that there are ways that we're looking at for that.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking
No, it's excellent feedback and exactly what we're here to have this conversation about. So, thank you.
Why don't you use photographs or sketches that actually represent what the conditions are?
That's at the top. Bottom one is.
That's what it's, at the top is a real photo, right?
Yes. Correct. From back when the downtown vision plan was done.
It's not what is possible.
It is, well, for just this element, it is what is possible.
It's the front yard. It's the 10 feet. It's the boulevard strip. It's the sidewalk and the landscaping that this example is talking about.
How are you preventing the springtime flooding?
How am I preventing the springtime flooding?
In other words, Rob's concern is that we should be showing, the photo should be showing that the sidewalk is above the base flood elevation. And it's showing it as level with the street. See, that's the thing. Nobody really quite understands. Is the sidewalk supposed to be at street level, or is the sidewalk supposed to be at, first floor level? Those two things are dramatically discrepant. And so we need to know how to reconcile them.
Yeah, well, and as a street that also doesn't have much in the way of drainage right now, it's definitely going to be a question as the city works with Public Works as to how that street drains and works.
You're not going to have much drainage either.
Yeah, and so that part of the reason why we're asking to make sure that development leaves that right of way is so that as the city knows what it needs to put in to deal with the spring flooding, that they have the space to do that. Another reason why this sort of 10-foot front yard setback is important is also for snow storage in addition to spring flooding, particularly if there are residential properties where you're shoveling a lot of entrances and entryways back there. There we go. Advance me. The second thing, and this is a flip in the type of use. So this is if you're doing that, those we're referring to, you got to give us at least 10 feet if it's ground floor residential. This is envisioning if you're ground floor commercial use, that we're setting a limit of 15 feet of how much front yard for a new building, not an existing one, you're going to build, unless it's improved with some usable open space, a pedestrian plaza, outdoor dining, something that is really contributing to the activity level on the sidewalk, folks there. And there's some examples here of, that can be something that's, very designed. That also, again, in the form of usable open space, could be as simple as an example I'm going to leave later in terms of where people are able to come and use it. Another benefit of that is offering outdoor dining in some seasons and potential for snow storage in others.
General intent is to keep storefronts close to the sidewalk.
So they're easier to walk to as well. the side and rear yards, right? And so these were when you asked about the existing versus the proposed, where currently there's no requirement for a side yard and 10 feet for the rear yard. We've established there are sort of two conditions, both where a downtown property is bordering an R district, a residential district, where we'd want to see those side yards and those rear yards be a little bit bigger just to give that buffer. And the overall principle that we're also identifying here, and I know this creates like 3 categories of side and rear yards, and that seems excessive, is that taller buildings, when you're up against that residential district, are requiring a slightly larger setback to get a better buffer to those areas. So if the building is less than 45 feet, it holds at that 10-yard rear setback, and the side setback, the side setback. If it's over 45 feet tall, then we want to see a side yard of at least 15 feet and a rear yard of 15 feet, just so that we're getting adequate buffering in those areas. The other aspect related to that point of a building over 45 feet tall is envisioning under which scenarios we might allow a building that, instead of being 55 feet tall as the current maximum, through the conditional use permit process, could go up another story to 65 feet. And so one of those is there's a physical recommendation, which is that we're recommending that top story be set back 10 feet from the front line of the building. That both sometimes really reduces, depending on where you're located and where you're taking. I very carefully took this photo so that we could see the setback floor. That can reduce the visual impact of that story there. It also has the side benefit, like in this example, of creating usable open space there. And, also just importantly, make sure that helps make sure that you're not getting too much of a tall building all located right on the front there. The other important thing is, since this is going through the conditional use permit process, that the proposal for a taller building is offering it public improvements that are contributing to the streetscape, public spaces, and are helping implement the recommendations of the Downtown Visioning Plan or other programs adopted by the city. And those criteria include the existing enhanced performance standards for a building that the staff looks at when they're reviewing a conditional use permit, as well as expecting, as planning board is reviewing these, a really high quality of design for these larger buildings, including that architectural quality and detail, historic preservation, universal design features that help increase the level of handicap and accessibility throughout the town, or sustainability features. Those are the sort of things that staff will also help weigh in the conditional use permit there.
So can I stop you?
Yes.
So I'm on the planning board, and we were discussing this. And I'd just like to take your imaginations for a second. Imagine diagonally across here where the supermarket used to be, that whole building. Imagine that somebody came in and bought that and put up a 65-foot building right there with commercial on the ground floor, close to where the sidewalk is rather than back. How do people feel about that? It's a big change, right? But that's what we're struggling with. It would be different from the New England architecture that we see around, but I can't come up with a definition of New England architecture. Maybe we could try Googling it and get all sorts of stuff. So keep that in mind. It's just a possibility. Does that make sense? That's what we're struggling with.
I feel like we need to not worry about that and worry more about making sure anything new is like net zero and fits more into a more renewable energy future. I think for me that's a higher concern than how so much.
I'm not sure that we have as much leverage on that aspect. We certainly talked to the developers how the building is going to be insulated and all of that sort of thing, but our purview is much more how does it look.
I'm hoping we have some kind of building code maybe that I don't know if we have any department that's in charge of that, but I think we should look at that. Because I can tell you where I live right now, It is a heat trap. It is not well done at all. There's no airflow. It's a horrible, horrible conditions to live in. And heat is year-round. I only turn on my furnace for like January and February, and that's it. I don't turn my heat on. It's off, all the way off. And my windows are open until it gets 32 below. I mean, 32 degrees. 32 degrees after that, the windows closed. That's how hot it is in that thing. So I'm just saying, I hope whatever new things get constructed, especially residential, please keep that in mind. Sorry.
Great.
So if the question, or the hypothetical that you suggest would happen, wouldn't it be the setback that was the critical issue? In other words, at one point at the end you said, then it was close to the sidewalk.
So there
But
would
if
be,
you had a setback that was proportionate,
right, but it'd be a 10-foot setback, which is different from what you have today.
why not change the setback as each level goes up?
I'm not sure. I've got to think about that. We were focused more on the
That's an
setback.
idea I don't want to.
No, I understand that. But the setback for the people walking along the sidewalk, so that the commercial is much closer and the parking is at the back, whereas today the parking is at the front or the side. That was the initial.
Oh, sure. You mean step the building back in height as you go up?
Each floor.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is that that particular building is just that it's on such a slope. I would imagine that there are ways to do that just and take advantage of the slope that's already there.
You mean mitigating the sense of height?
Exactly. Yes, that's yes. I don't know. When calculating building height, for instance, and you are on a slope, and you've got one floor here and one floor here. When you calculate the building height, is it an average? It's like what it's like in the middle of the building, and that's where your meeting height is?
So it depends on the definition, which I can see Tim referencing his document right here to make sure we read the accurate definition.
We're not proposing to amend building height as a definition. It's in Appendix A of the zoning ordinance. So the current definition of building height is it's the vertical distance measured from the average elevation of the proposed finished grade at the front of the building to the highest point of the roof or parapet. So it's based on the where the front of the building is.
Oh, where the front is. Okay.
Right.
And then that would kind of depend on where you consider the front of the building.
Correct. There's some flexibility there.
So if it dips down to the river, toward the back, you can only go by the front, not the back.
Yes.
For sense of scale, the 55 foot, which is the current, that's similar to the height of this building we're in right now, and the building over there, for a 4 to 5 story traditional building. So that's a condition you have already. The 65 potential additional height.
Well, I guess so. If someone, okay, so you've got a building on a slope like this, and you're deciding that the high end is where you're going to consider the front of your building, so along where the entrance to the IGA is, right? Mm-hmm. And so from there you're going 55, maybe 65 feet, and on the back end, on the back side, what's going to be?
No, it would actually be not where the current entrance is, because the building would be brought to the street where it's low. So the front of the building would be closer to the street, which is probably at least 10
So in other
feet.
words, you would require them to change the front of the building.
If they were totally got rid of the current structure, total blank slate.
It's just, again, you're on the slope, so then, the approach becomes difficult.
And we will show an example, because there you do have sites with topography here, but frequently what many of those sites are used is for the ability to provide a level of parking behind those buildings, sort of tucked. As we sort of said, our goal is having the parking behind the building. The natural slope down provides a really great way to do that. And there's some real opportunity in some of these sites in Lebanon to provide that well.
Awesome.
Yes.
I have a sidewalks the other day. Probably have. I'd be worried that not just about what it looks from the front, but what it looks from the back. The river right there is an incredible treasure, and we don't get to see it very often unless you go visit communications.
I feel like you're foreshadowing later parts of my presentation, really, in a really important point. And part of why we've written in the site plan regulations that when staff is choosing the facade of the building, they need to take into account what has the highest level of pedestrian traffic, public ways, public spaces, like the riverfront as well.
Or what could have.
What could have, right? What's in plans.
Right now it doesn't have it.
Yeah.
Because you have to stumble through stuff.
Yes, which is also why when we looked at that diagram of where the sheets were shaded colors, there was hatching through all of the parking areas along the river, that if those were to be developed, we'd really want that to be really looking at engaging the riverfront. Another potential proposal related to height is a potential minimum height for new buildings, not existing buildings, of 2 stories. And the goal of that would be to match the existing context, which is largely at least 2 stories tall through the area. And provide for that walkable downtown density. The other thing is that in combination with some of the other requirements, like the parking located behind the building, to discourage sort of strip mall style commercial development in this core of downtown. One option is, rather than providing this height limit or minimum as stories, we could provide it as a minimum height, so that if someone had a use or a building where they wanted a tall floor, but didn't want to actually make those separate habitable floors at that time, that might be an option. So that's something we'll keep discussing with staff as to what's most appropriate in this area. Yes?
What happened to the 65 feet?
That's a maximum. So the goal... So this is the minimum.
Okay.
So you go somewhere between 2 and 65. Or 22 and 65 if we're measuring it in feet versus stories. Another thing, right, is that in going back between setting a height requirement in feet or setting a height requirement in stories, we thought it really important to pay attention to what really modern construction techniques mean for sort of floor-to-floor height, and making sure that spaces work for a variety of uses. And also that you don't have a situation where someone tries to get an extra story by making really short floor-to-floor heights because of that overall height limit potentially of 65 feet. So what we're proposing here is that there be the street level story be a minimum of 12 feet, and that stories above that could be a minimum of 10 feet. And there's not a maximum. If you want to build a climbing gym with apartments on top, you could have a 30-foot story and a 10-foot story and still be under the overall height limit.
I'm just going to reiterate one more time. If you're walking down a sidewalk, you're at grade level, and you're looking into a 12-foot tall facade, like the one in the picture. Mm-hmm. That actually looks really cool. But when you're walking down the street and the top of that building is now 16 and a half feet high, you're looking up into, really far up into a commercial space, and that is really awkward. So again, I do think that we need to reconsider what other factors come into play when considering, just your building height.
What is Ava Gallery? Is that probably something akin to that?
I believe when we measured Ava, they were at 14 from the sidewalk. But that was, again, not a
right.
I did not physically measure it in person.
Right, but also Ava, is actually at grade.
Right. Well, and your floor to heights are going to be measured from grade, not from. But I hear what you're saying in terms of making sure that the regulations are providing for design strategies to deal with the need to elevate out of the floodplain.
Yes.
And at the same time, making sure that your ground floor is usable for a variety of uses once you get up to it, however you get up to it, probably means that it's coming in at 12 feet as a floor.
Ava isn't that great, though. Normal on the street.
Yeah, so we're just saying what their first floor height is.
Well, I'm saying to get up into the first floor, you have to go up 4 steps.
Right. Right.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
When you go on the side entrance where most of us go,
Right.
the main entrance,
Right.
the parking lot rises, and you walk up the pavement on the sidewalk from the street side to the door. You go up as well. So that's higher. But if you look on the street side, on the street side, you have to walk up 3 or 4 steps, maybe to the top.
Okay.
Yes.
I need more explanation, because let's leave the example alone.
Yeah.
Just as he says, I didn't understand what you're saying. When you're walking down the street and
You're walking down the street. So if I'm walking down the street.
Yeah, that's right there.
Right. Where I am.
And that's
So
12 feet high.
the front of the first floor of my building, the floor starts.
The building right there is 12 feet.
No, but where that building is, you're going 12 feet from where my feet are.
Yeah.
Okay? In my building, you're going 12 feet up from here.
But don't you need space just to have space? I mean,
Well, I don't know.
where would you have your
You're
storage?
talking about floodplain. We're talking about the floodplain. I have to get above the
Right.
floodplain. Right. And so part of it was that when you walk down the street, these shop fronts are supposed to be inviting you to come in.
Yeah.
And that clearly does. But
And I don't have any problem with this they're up either.
But exactly, but you're already at grade. So what I'm saying is when you're walking along the sidewalk of the street, it's not inviting you to come in. It's saying, ugh, that's a lot of work. I don't want to go there.
That's declared out of shop fronts are not negotiable or elevated sites.
That is what I'm saying, yes.
Yep. Yep.
Can I ask for the upper stories?
Yes.
A minimum of 10 feet. How many feet has the person inside that finished room got? Because I don't think I can change the light bulb.
In the
It's 10 feet. It's 10 feet.
well, it's probably somewhere between 9 and 8.5, depending on the construction type and the literally how they run ventilation. You're gonna need a step ladder for generally to reach the ceiling in there.
Yeah.
But most multifamily construction we see tends to come in around 11 now in terms of floor to floor heights. So we felt pretty comfortable that this was setting a fair minimum in terms of construction standards and techniques for there.
Houses are just 8 feet.
Yeah.
But you got to count the floor assembly.
No, I understand. But even so, you're 8 feet and that takes it to 9.
It's hard to build a new multi-story building that's less than 10 feet per story. In fact, it's somewhat difficult to get 4 stories in 45 feet. Just by reference, Court Street, which is only 3 stories, is a full 45 feet because it's off the parapet. And the first floor is closer to 15 feet, but that's the nature of it.
Right. So we did really try and think for the type of construction we're envisioning that we're setting these at minimum, not even necessarily what might be the target in a mixed-use multifamily building on a floor-to-floor basis. So this is that same building that I was showing there, and the advantage of here is it's pointing to an issue you pointed out immediately, is that there's the opportunity to provide parking because of the slope of the site. So that is the ground floor where you walk in. They have a little extra storage space below grade there, and then this is all parking that's underneath the building. But part of what we also want to sort of cite here is that the parking is really, the sidewalk's a pleasant environment. It's got some landscape buffering, and the parking's being provided behind primarily and beside the building there, as opposed to right in front so when you're a pedestrian, your process of accessing this building is not through walking through the parking lot there. Yes?
How are you going to deal with the springtime floods?
This particular one is not in the plan. This is just...
This is an example. It's an example project in Acton, Massachusetts.
Well, obviously, it's here.
Yeah. But there is actually a creek right behind here. This is part of related to the. Honestly, I imagine it's part of why this area was not finished space. We did look at where the floodplain is delineated on Spencer Street there.
But that's different than actually seeing the model.
Yeah. I mean, I guess...
You have property there, I don't, but...
Yeah.
Am I describing it wrong?
No, you're not. But,
So how do we have this kind of construction and development and deal with the fact that you're dealing with a wetland?
It's not being prescribed for all of the streets. It's for where that situation would be appropriate. You might, and we're not even talking about underground parking as a requirement, and period. This is just an example of not having it be in the front part of the property.
Why? Right. What happens when you don't have the parking go straight into the parking lot, that you bring it out around the other side of the the sidewalk?
Yes.
When we get to the part where you actually describe the real conditions we have in the district you're talking about, because so far you've ignored the fact that you're dealing with a historic district, which is a third or a half of what you're talking about. You don't have any say on what you do. The Heritage Commission that I chair does.
So the Heritage Commission controls the historic fabric in the building, and I'm looking at Rebecca because I believe you lead the Heritage Commission, correct?
Yeah, I help to integrate. We haven't gotten to the building aspect.
I chair the Heritage Commission.
Correct.
She's our staff member.
Right.
Okay?
Yes.
We monitor and regulate any changes to the exterior to the building.
Right.
We don't have anything to do with what's going on inside.
Right.
We don't deal with color of paint.
Mm-hmm. So the use changes we talked at the beginning.
The mall may not seem historic to you.
It seems super historic to me.
What?
It's super historic.
Well, it's all post-64, right?
Yeah.
But it's part of our historic district.
Right.
As well as the properties around the green.
Yeah.
Now, the Spencer Street is quite different. That's not in the historic district.
Correct.
There are historic aspects of that street.
Right.
Which we recognize, but that's not something we regulate.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got two regimes here. One is regulated because they're in the historic district, and the other is Spencer Street and Meg's properties in that district.
Right.
And we want it to be usable, functional, safe, and not flooded all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But we also want to keep the historic character in the historic district.
Right.
And what you're dealing with is you're going to have properties lifted above the floodplain.
In small selections of Spencer Street,
yeah.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And that should be accounted for in the zoning, and I don't think you've captured that here from the way you described it.
Okay. So all of these requirements here I don't conflict with lifting the building above the floodplain, but I also want to make sure we call it David, because the reality is that many of these properties have overlapping regulatory regimes, and they include the floodplain and the rules around that, the zoning requirements, depending on the scale of development and change you're making, the site plan review process, and depending on where it's located, the Historic Commission. So depending on the project, different elements of these regulations are going to apply at all times. But you're absolutely correct about the exterior building features and the Historic Commission's role in that.
So, Rob, there is a floodplain district, as you know. We're not proposing to change that. We're not proposing to change Chapter 74, which covers the floodplain regulations. We're not changing the mapping or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about tonight. The pictures that are included within this presentation are intended to depict individual concepts, such as this one shows principal frontage and parking to the side and rear. You're absolutely right that when we apply those concepts to Spencer Street, it may look a little bit different. It will have to look
different. This as a flooded building in the spring, right? Because I've been on Spencer Street in the spring.
I mean, but the way it gets built will have to comply with the floodplain regulations, just as Emerson Place does. It's got parking under the building. If water goes in, it's allowed to flow out based on the way that building was designed and constructed. That's how and why it is where it is. Again, the pictures here, you're right, that they don't depict every aspect of each concept that we're trying to describe, and they don't depict the way it will look on Spencer Street or Hanover Street or Bank Street. But we're trying to isolate the specific concepts, and then when they get applied locally, they will have to address all of the historic district, the floodplain overlay district, all of the different districts. It will all have to be designed, and Meg's building will have to be, she'll have to work with her architect and building and planning to figure out how to make that work in a way that makes sense.
Well, you understand, I'm not objecting to anything Meg is doing.
And my objection is not that I've made my case for the floodplain. It's going to flood. That's a stupid good idea. It's raising your building above the floodplain. Yeah. Why wouldn't you do that? My only concern is that some of these other regulations about floor heights and things like that are going to be overly burdensome when laid on top of all, what is already a big challenge in just getting into my building and becoming flood compliant. That's
and I quite agree with that entirely.
Absolutely. And so I think we've had enough discussion to really cover that. I guess the last place on there, right, is that where the city staff is designating that primary frontage based on pedestrian flows. If there's another access, we're getting access off there. If you only have frontage on Spencer Street or Bank Street, that's where that curb cut is going to have to happen. So it's in no place are these restrictions going to cut off access to property, even as they're trying to provide for more continuity along the sidewalk there. So that's the zoning regulations. And then we really would move into the site plan regulations, which are much more covering what happens around the building and in terms of the design of the building. Yes, you had a question.
Which of those is windows?
The windows are under site plan regulations. Yeah. Also great foreshadowing. And I'm going to try and click this through. There. So again, layout. There, you have really strong existing site plan regulations. What we've tried to do is pull out where there are places we can provide metrics or clearer guidelines for staff and for project developers to follow. We're doing that. One of the things we're going to do throughout this presentation is try and show a variety of types of buildings, because the site plan regulations have to cover a sort of wide variety of sites, from Spencer Street to possible infill along the riverfront and the parking lot behind us to sites along Hanover Street, to also show kind of consistently one project so we could see how elements of that would be applied there. One thing to keep in mind is site plan regulations when they apply, and that's, again, new buildings, significant reconstruction of an existing building, when at least 1,000 square feet of new building area or improved surface, so that's you're laying a new parking lot, you're disturbing that area, is constructed on an existing site cumulatively. And also conversions that increase either the density or intensity of or to multifamily residential use and intensity of commercial use with on or off-site impacts, which is a lot of phrases to describe a big picture idea that if you are essentially making a use more intense, more dense in the downtown area, then you're going to come through site plan review to make sure it's meeting all these requirements. So, to your point, one of the first things we sort of set out within building design is just the importance of how these regulations ultimately undergird historic preservation. And so they include recommendations to make sure that they're relating to visual interest, that they're using materials, and relating to the surrounding buildings. And another thing is that we're also recommending that when you apply for a site plan approval, that if you're in the Colburn Park Historic District, in addition to where the Historic Commission is reviewing the property, the site plan review application is going to include a narrative on how this proposal would be compatible with the Colburn Park Historic District National Register nomination. So really making sure that the importance of historic preservation and knowledge of those elements here in downtown is at the forefront of some of the building design ideas. Yes?
I remember when you showed this to the planning board, and I've never seen the actual food co-ops. I'm only going by this picture.
Yeah.
But do you know what the reaction to the neighborhood, from the neighborhood and the people who live near, to that very odd front panel that looks like there's nothing behind it, unless you realize that behind it is a lower level?
I don't know exactly. I do know it's been in part, I think, because of the number of uses and many of the site design elements they've made as we go through this, that it's been a very successful and popular project within Brattleboro, and has won a couple of designs.
Just to clarify, it is a 4-story building.
Yeah.
Right, but you have to really realize that from this photo, because what's behind it...
Because it looks like it's just this flat.
Right.
It looks like a false front.
Correct.
You're right. And one of the things about this example is it does deal with a couple of different conditions, like having 2 street frontages, navigating a corner, and grade changes that do make design frequently very challenging when you're the architect or the civil engineer of a project. And we think they have some strategies that are good for dealing with it to be able to show in these examples, but are other things that have different results in the design and probably are specific to the context of what they were going through there. So one of the first things we're sort of recommending is setting some metrics on opaque wall surfaces, the facade surfaces. And the goal there is that those would not extend more than 20 feet horizontally along the facade when you're on that principal street frontage. So that frontage where most of the pedestrians are, where people are walking, before you'd have sort of either windows or a door or an entryway. Where, because of the use, because of the site constraints, something like that needs to happen, we'd want to see strategies like plantings, a green wall, murals, other decorative strategies to make that not feel as if you're just sort of walking along a set of concrete there. Another element of site plan regulations is thinking about screening. And so I like this example because it includes both good examples of screening and some bad examples of screening all at once. So they did a good job of hiding the dumpsters behind the concrete wall and getting the sort of decorative wood up there. So those are check marks. And then they kind of left these guys out there and clearly are not management, right, is always a part of screening. The second example is looking at, this probably is not the right sort of design strategy for Lebanon, but in situations where there's a lot of mechanical equipment located on the roof in order to locate it effectively, if it's not screened by, another aspect of the building design from view, that you might include an element that provides that screening there. Another sort of important thing is orientation, and this really gets to the point that you made earlier about the riverfront. And so this was an illustration drawing from the downtown vision plan of how development might infill into the parking lot areas and really embrace the riverfront as a place to be. And so this very much relates to our recommendation that buildings be oriented towards public ways and sidewalks to prioritize pedestrian access, and that secondary orientation and access to trails, the riverfront and other public spaces is just an important design element. And so in Brattleboro, they've got that view we saw from the parking lot earlier. There's also orientation on the sidewalk as that heads up the hill there. So corner property, really trying to orient where possible both places. The other thing is that there's a riverfront trail that is there in this property. And so they've also done some work in making sure that that pathway is clear and there's an entrance that really relates to that location there. Another aspect of design, particularly when thinking of allowing for larger buildings in the downtown area, is how we make sure the form is compatible with the fine grain of some of the existing fabric. So we've got examples of where we are recommending a metric of a pedestrian entrance every 60 feet. Or again, if that's not possible because of the use of the building security requirements, that we get a vertical design element. So that could be a bay window, a change in materials, something that provides that visual break. That if a facade is over 100 feet long, which would be quite long for a primary, principal street frontage in Lebanon, that there be a change of material, detailing, a change of massing that would help provide sort of visual difference and relief. And that if a building's incorporating a stair tower or elevator on the exterior of a building, where that's a sort of visible element as opposed to sort of interior to the building, that that be expressed as a vertical design element there. The other thing, windows, back to our foreshadowed items. And what we're recommending is some requirements that are measurable, right, and provide metrics based on where a building is located. So if you're on one of those streets where we're a primary street where we're proposing there be a ground floor commercial requirement, you're going to have higher requirements for windows for those ground floors than a residential building where you're going to window pattern that's going to reflect need for privacy and other elements. So overall, as a basic rule, more windows being provided on the ground floor than on upper floors when it's a commercial building, and needing more for retail uses than other uses. And this is just to look back at that map. I think one of the things we heard really clearly here today is to take a closer look at Spencer Street and whether having that be yellow is appropriate there. But in terms of where these window requirements would apply, again, this would be a condition that would not exist for a grandfathered historic building that doesn't meet the requirements. So the example here and what I've sort of done is outlined in the boxes here what these are. And I went ahead and also used some examples from here in the historic building fabric in Lebanon. And what this shows is that sort of where we have like the ground floor here of Salt Hill Pub and that traditional sort of building fabric is coming in at a 50% transparency for that ground floor. So really big storefront windows getting back and forth. The Citizens Bank, which is operating more into an office typology, coming in at 30% there. And that the upper floors are at 25%. And that's more or less consistent across a variety of the historic building types and window patterns in, yes?
One thing I do want to make a comment about is that when you first showed this shot, I don't think the Citizens Bank had left that building.
Yes, and now it's a different place.
Is that on the 3 left windows on the ground floor, it's some form of physical therapy, which means they have blanked out the windows. And quite frankly, that's not inviting. But they can't do anything else because they need the space to be private.
Right.
So how do you handle that as a city volunteer commissioner or board member? How you can't tell a retailer they can't do that. So in a building like this one that we have no reason to change,
right?
Correct?
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with the fact that all of a sudden there is no transparency on the back end side of the
Did
front
they
door?
permanently blank it out, or might the future tenant
That's what I
remove
don't know.
it? So at least it's adaptable.
So
At least
that
the windows are there.
And Rebecca's getting to the key point, which is that we can't control whether someone pulls their blinds down all day long, or shades it off. But we can control whether the glass is there in the building.
Yeah.
And then, so what?
Significant difference. Feeling welcome. Say again?
The casino did the same thing.
The casino in the pizza. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have no control over that. And
yeah.
Casinos, forgive me, bad enough, but to have them blank out all the windows is adding insult to injury. And in this case, The bank, that was for the bank. I don't know if the bank was the original. Cliff, do you know, before, was the bank always there? A bank always there?
It's been a long time since they occupied any of that front left corner. I mean, they shrunk down a long time ago.
They shrunk their footprint.
Oh, is that right?
Back of the lobby. You go through the lobby and their main operations was for... They might have had a couple offices on those right.
I just remember that those blinds were not down.
There have been different office uses off to the left for quite some time.
But yeah, operation, of course, always an issue in terms of the effects, but goals of these requirements is to make sure the windows are at least there. Yeah, so that, and you may have a tenant that is a sort of a blinds down neighbor, right, in terms of the use in the space. And 5 years later, there may be a new tenant in there that is a doors open neighbor, making sure that the space is there and ready to convert for that use.
Even for windows, you can still envision a display window that's got a solid backing to it. So there could be a product or...
That happened in 1 Court Street. Yeah. Even when the eye doctor offices were there, they did black out the stuff on the right, but when you first saw the door to the right of the main entrance to Cliff's building, you would see examples of what they sold and an eye chart and stuff. I mean, it's a very different aspect if you want people to be walking around and looking.
So from a privacy standpoint, inside they have the privacy they need. Outside, there's still something interesting to look at as well.
But planning can't do anything with that, either the professionals or the volunteers, right?
Right.
That's what I thought.
We can, as we're talking about, we can try to make sure the window's there. Who the tenant ends up being.
No, but you can't say how they use it.
No, you can't, unfortunately. That's so the best laid plan still could result in...
Yes.
There might be some benefit if an architect is trying to be sympathetic to the historical building. Mm-hmm. And the historical building is development.
Correct. Yes.
At least should be an It's very important to have that sensitivity.
Correspondence. Yeah. And hence why at the building design at the beginning, we've got that point on compatibility and historic preservation.
In the historical preservation.
Across all of downtown.
Oh.
Right? And so it's because not all of downtown is getting the benefit of the level of examination the Historic Commission's doing. And more modern building types might be appropriate in certain areas of the downtown, but we want to make sure that they're taking into account how they are drawing contrast, how they're compatible, how they're fitting in with the historic buildings.
Requirements of percent transparency. Mm-hmm. That is practical. You want to pick up the sympathetic look.
Right.
There's still a provision that allows you to get out.
Well, and part of why they're in the site plan regulations is to allow there to be guidelines of how those are applied. We have put them by use. What you're sort of making clear to me is making sure that we're clear that we're allowing a waiver for historic window patterns where needed, where that... One of the things that's interesting about downtown is we have a bunch of old houses that are commercial uses now, particularly on the other side of Colburn Park. And if someone wanted to build a compatible building but still wanted it to be office use, they might not be meeting the office use window requirements. And so, we can make sure that guidance is clear within the site plan regs. One thing for residential, we do want to be clear is that having the recommendation that there be operable windows within a single wall opening as being, really important to residential use property. And I'm going to try and speed up because you guys have been listening to zoning for a long time. Another key point, right, this is an environment with a lot of weather, the importance of weather protection at entrances. That being particularly important when you have ground floor residential, and really encouraging features that provide a little bit of a transition between public space and private space, be that a porch, a deck, those individual entrances. Yes?
Yeah, this is one of the things that brought me here, actually. I looked at all of your sites before I came.
Yeah, thank you.
But stoops, you seem to be requiring stoops for residential. This immediately says that disabled people cannot live here.
So a stoop or a raised landing can still be ramped. And what we probably should have done is put a ramped version, not just a stepped version, in this picture.
But ramps usually protrude out and create problems for snow removal, problems for getting permits for them if you're in certain places. We spent 4 months negotiating a ramp in my homeowners association.
Yeah.
Because it looked like it's been really on it was dangerous.
There's no requirement that a stoop be elevated necessarily. So,
yeah.
A stoop is simply a transition space between the sidewalk and the entrance. And this would be a stoop here.
That's
as a level entrance. It's providing that place where you're bringing the door up by something.
So the door is inset.
Yes. In this particular example, the doors are inset. But yeah, it can be provided in a raised fashion. It can be provided in a ramped fashion to raise, or it could be provided level as appropriate.
Oh, that's a good point. I think too.
Wheelchair housing.
Yeah. And one of the broader sort of building design messages we included at that beginning one is just how important universal design features are, and that they're always encouraged as the staff is reviewing the site plan regulations of how we're ensuring that those are fitting in, and that to the sort of point of the ability to sort of get wiggle room in what we're putting as a metric in order to fulfill a goal of compatibility, that universal accessibility is one of those where they have the ability to do that, to make sure it's provided.
And so the term weather protection is a design term, but besides actual weather protection, it's also partly to have a clear distinction between the public and private realm, because when you're residential and right at the street, and suddenly there's just a door flush with the street, you don't have that sense of this is where the boundaries are. And it's also an architectural feature instead of just a flat wall, a flat mass. It adds three-dimensionality to the secondary features of a building. And then lastly, it may not be the only entrance to the building. So if it's a larger building with multiple units, there should be plenty of accessible units, whether they're at the front or the side or the back, if they're going to truly adhere to universal accessibility.
Yep. And and then we've kind of made this point across all of the recommendations, but one of the points here is that where pedestrian access is linking through a parking lot, that we sort of demarcate what that sort of path is, so it's sort of visible for both pedestrians and vehicles of where folks should be traveling. Exactly to your point here, this accessible design feature is being encouraged in all instances. That downtown's a real opportunity to expand that, and that's one of the real benefits that new construction can offer as a complement to the historic fabric we have here. We've sort of gone over this issue of ground floor residential, getting that transition, usable open space, and that the other just only thing I'll note here is that having that service areas and storage not being located in the front yard where there's other access space appropriate. Some design guidelines for those commercial uses, so what we were talking about in terms of outdoor dining, plazas, usable open space for people where they are providing a front yard there and it's set back. And some examples from here, and also another example where, that's some usable open space that's sort of being provided there.
That's right?
Yep, exactly. And then, that we're complying with the existing requirements within the site plan regulations to screen parking areas, and the existing requirements of perimeter landscaping. So making sure that those buffers are in where the allowance of the site allows. And then for parking areas, that if it's with a building, we're getting a landscape buffer of at least 5 feet where that's coming up against a street frontage. If a parking lot, it would be sort of built as a principal use, so someone's creating a parking lot with no building attached to it, that we get a landscaped barrier of a buffer of at least 5 to 10 feet, and that include at least one tree every 50 linear feet. And if we were to sort of build a new, parking structure, that same sort of requirement for sort of use on the ground floor, if it's on a retail priority street. So this is really just envisioning a situation where a parking structure was built in that limited area of red on Hanover Street, right by from downtown coming into Colburn Park, or the parking lots around the mall, where that's up on that sort of where the staff is determining principal frontage, where the most pedestrians are, that's getting screened with an active use at minimum depth. Yeah.
I can't really read what the white.
What it says.
It's a library.
It's a library. So this was, we included this project because, it includes some retail stores, but because it was a public-private partnership, part of their sort of requirement for this was that they...
Because they couldn't figure out what you could stick in there to the depth of only 20 feet. You couldn't put an apartment.
No, yeah, you're likely looking at a shop or retail, some sort of display space. Yeah.
To another point, I've been looking recently quite a lot on the websites at the kind of design they created in downtown New Orleans.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the houses...
I used to live there.
Excuse me?
I used to live there.
Oh, you're very lucky.
Yeah.
I've never been.
Not in the summer.
The houses have back porches in many cases, and what faces the street is not an entrance. So you'd have to go down a brick walk or some other manufactured walk and go in by the side where the porches are put. Now, I haven't noticed anything in your slides that would reflect that kind of architecture. Is that not going to be feasible going forward? Because it's not New England, I know that.
Yeah.
It's a way to get the frontage not caught up with an entrance off the
street.
Off the walk.
So those were for residential, right?
Yeah, the ones I'm looking at were for residential, yeah. And I don't know that it would work in the downtown central business
It is New England to the extent that most people have got their primary entrances from the garage into the house on the side, and their front doors are
Right. That's right. I just wondered if that was anything that you have images of, not in New Orleans, that we might look at.
Yeah, if I would be happy if you want to send us the example of what you're thinking of, and we can try and think if we can think of an example that might fit that and the size here to think about how that either would or wouldn't be appropriate to the regulations. Final thing is just, we've talked about the sort of common themes, the relationship to neighboring buildings. We've also put in a little bit of a standard where, just some privacy standards if balconies are sort of being adjacent to a side property line. Again, when we're in adjacent to those residential areas, getting that buffer. And if you're in a situation where only that one side of the property is providing the light and air for the building, that we're ensuring we're getting a setback there. It's there's probably one or two parcels where that provision would apply in downtown, but it's a sort of statement of principle also seemed an important one to include in there. And I think just thank you all for being such an attentive and inquisitive audience. I really appreciate it. We've tried to really just go through this in a way that gets to implementing that vision from the downtown vision plan and making sure that's really appropriate to the wide variety of parcels, uses, and possible development that could be happening downtown.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your attention. As we said at the outset, there's a long way to go for these regulations. There's a lot more public opportunities for public input. This same presentation will be given to the planning board again next Monday. It will go. Yes, Sarah will help us give the presentation next Monday.
But I will try and get you an image of a side entrance door.
From there, the expectation is that we'll have the consultants back in September, and they will give this presentation incorporating the comments and the feedback and the ideas that we've heard tonight and next Monday, and they'll give that presentation to the City Council. And that will be that is envisioned to be part of the kickoff process for the zoning amendments that happen each fall. If the council decides that it wants to move these forward, then these regulations would get a legal review, and they would be presented again to the planning board, to the zoning board, and to the conservation commission before coming back to the city council for a public hearing, which would likely happen in January. So there's many more opportunities for input, for ideas, for questions, concerns. If you have any concerns based on what you've seen tonight, feel free to contact us in the planning department to relay those. Give us a call, send us an email, whatever's most convenient. Feel free to stop in if you're in City Hall. We want to hear from you. We need to hear from you in order to move these forward in a way that's going to accommodate or accomplish the goals that we're trying to achieve in a way that is fair and feasible for given the complexities and the intricacies of different properties like Spencer Street, like the historic district and the mall, for example. So, question.
We just got the contract for feasibility study on. My name is contract for feasibility study on the Entrepreneur Center at the River Valley.
Oh, great.
School. And one of the things that is required in that contract is that the purpose behind the Entrepreneur Center is to support and one of the things that is of concern to me is that people don't come down to a downtown area just because they're free. They can go to West Lebanon, buy whatever it's going on. There has to be an attraction that brings them. And personally, I find when I look at images like this, I don't find that element of what has to happen to the town with these images. And the reason why I bring it up is because this is a rare opportunity for, through renderings and through a continuity of plan that speaks to why people want to come downtown. And if we present these zoning requirements in the context of buildings that do not easily architecturally add to what we're trying to do, we're losing this tremendous opportunity to get it in our heads what it is we're trying to do downtown. And certainly from an entrepreneurial standpoint, why do you attract entrepreneurs? Why would they follow coming into zone area just because it's zone? They come in because they're stuck traffic. Right? So I am just asking consultants to go the extra step to try to work out what is this town supposed to look like in our best estimate. I mean, we can't control everything, and zoning alone doesn't do it. But common-based images among a lot of people does do it, because it's still consensus.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. I'm thinking, well, if we're going to take away, I mean, the reason why people come here is from spring through fall, we have things like this happening.
Yep. Exactly.
You know, we have our parades, we have different events, people come out, and I'm just trying to figure out how to do a little bit of traveling that I've done in other cities, whether they're big or whether they're small. How do they maintain what people already support, like this kind of event, and still accommodate, you know, like you were talking about New Orleans. I was just there about a year ago,
And all along the river, in that French Quarter, there's all those ugly old buildings, but they have the walk right along the river. And so even though some of the businesses are gone, they've taken these parking lots and used those to accommodate any traffic that comes in so people can still come there and do those fun things. But I'm sure they still have problems. I'm sure they still have congestion. And I'm just scared that, we want to make it walkable, but people aren't going to throw their cars away. And if we build more apartments, we're going to have at least 2 cars because people don't work at the same locations. Those kind of things are real. And I'm just scared that if we say, let's develop downtown, we're going to have problems. I want to make sure we think about the problems. And I know, having been on the school board, we don't always think of all the problems. We don't think of all the problems.
My only concern about the zoning is that, look at the table. Look at the seats and look at the green space that's been built up there. And the ambiance is something that's attractive. But the zoning that we just looked at doesn't capture, in my opinion.
Okay.
You say 15 feet.
Yeah.
Right? Can you put a cafe there? I don't know. 15 feet, so a little bit, but if you got to walk, does that pick it up? All I'm saying is there has to be, it's almost like you have to jump to the purpose of why you're doing it, and then try to match it, or at least make some kind of compliance waiver that pushes people in that direction, rather than these flat buildings, 15 feet, sidewalk. And I can assure you, people won't drive less time with the parking is better, and they have a better choice of what they want to buy.
Or they'll order it on Amazon.
Or order it on Amazon worse. Yeah, exactly. So I'm just saying that when we put the zoning together, we have an image in our mind. Because when we're talking the entrepreneur center, we're saying we got to get commercial retail, we got to get people downtown, we got to have people walking about. That's why you attract the good stores. Because you've made it so that people want to come. And I realize we have the historical district, and that's all part of what you're working on.
Well, I also represent the Arts and Culture Commission, and we're trying to make Lebanon much more centered, the economy of Lebanon centered on the arts.
Exactly.
Right? Because we want to attract people to Lebanon, right? And this is why I think having your pictures of Spencer Street that don't look anything like what's possible on Spencer Street because you have to deal with the flooding problem. I think that's going the wrong way. We have to deal with the realities of what's going on. So we've got a lot of resource here. And a lot of this area can be developed in a way that's very effective. But I don't find the sketch map that you used at the beginning, and I don't find most of the images used here actually something that supports arts and culture and heritage.
Yeah,
downtown area.
You're on the same thing I'm on.
Yeah. And we're going to and all of your proposed zoning changes to the mall and around Culver Park, they don't really matter in some ways for the existing buildings because we monitor all of that.
Correct.
And they're not going to change the overall structure of that except in very small ways.
Correct.
Right?
The use of
we have in those buildings on the other side of the park some of the old buildings that have been revamped in various ways. The music center and Dana Seguin's building that's been changed, the old wood building. Those we've given a great deal of flexibility to the owners to reorganize their properties in some way. We want to retain the historic facades in most cases as much as we can. But we've allowed a lot of change because we want to adjust to the realities. But we want to keep some of the historic features. And none of what you're talking about really affects that in a very significant way for the historic district, which includes the mall.
If somebody buys Shutori, there's that one building there. That would be directly what we're talking about. So we got to focus on where the changes could happen, and do they make sense?
Well, they still have to come to us, to the Heritage, because that's in the historic district.
Is the river in the historic district?
No.
Well, that's one of the biggest concerns I have.
The river is going to be nightmarish in other ways, but not for Heritage.
Because if you would go and say, I use Milwaukee as an example, they had something called the Third Ward, right? It was not a nice neighborhood. And they decided that they were going, I don't know if you're familiar with that particular way that they approached it, but they decided that they were going to turn everything around because it was on the river flowing through. And they got to work, and it extended the historical district because it mimicked the historical district. In some cases, they saved the building, and the buildings themselves, the ones that were saved, mimicked the historical district. Today, that is the hottest area in that city. That is where everybody wants to live. And when you look at Lebanon, you got short-term issues that you got to deal with, longer-term issues you got to deal with, and the zoning is going to suddenly put a building up, which takes that option and just that's it. You don't have that option anymore because the building becomes. Well, I have seen it. Go to Europe sometime and see some of those buildings in these beautiful towns. And a bank comes along and puts up something that looks like a German toolbox. It is horrible. And take that section of town and just don't bother working on it because it's a monument you can't do anything with. So all I'm saying is when you get the zoning in place, you really got to look at it. How do we turn this town around so that it becomes a draw? Not just in the historical district, but in all the zoning.
But we've got a very clear footprint of the historic district, which is around the green.
Right.
But we also have the mall, which is we also regulate. Right?
This is also regulated, right? But I'm also thinking it's a mall.
But it's down the hill here toward the river.
Yes.
In Spencer Street.
Right.
This is why Meg's comments earlier are really quite pertinent to my way of thinking.
I don't want to undo the good work you've all done. No. I just want to make sure that it's got the long-term vision for the town in place.
Yeah. And I also realize you're talking about zoning regulations. You're trying to implement zoning regulations. And I'm less conversant with some of those issues. But it is helpful when you use images that actually reflect what we've actually got here. And the kind of floodplain problems we've got here.
I think
I didn't see that.
We will change our images to reflect that.
Because that really works against us understanding community what's going on.
I'm a conservation person. I don't represent it. We really, the Muskoma River, it's not just the floodplain down on Spencer Street. That's one part of it, but it flows through the city. It flows past this building. Most of it is not accessible at this point. And we've got to have a balance between being close to it and accessible in some ways, but not destroying it. And if you had this instead of that mammoth building that may be going up, or maybe both of them would fit along the stretch beyond the pizza building. And people were down, I don't know if it's possible, down across from your building or as part of your building, when they were running the rapids in the spring, people could be at tables watching that, and it's beautiful any other time of year. We need to take advantage of that.
There's tremendous opportunities. We heard a lot about that.
And that goes all the way behind Emerald Street.
Yeah. There's a lot of sentiment like that in the vision process, and I would say the zoning itself won't do a whole lot to realize this. There's a separate process of investment in infrastructure. The city controls a lot of this land, and either through its own infrastructure or through specific redevelopment ideas, and more specific review of design ideas here. I think focus both on the sort of program attractions and also the design of the landscape of the buildings to so I think that the zoning we're talking about is still a fairly blunt tool that's trying to apply to many different areas. I think that the main consistent element we're trying to get is that walkable. So that anywhere you want to walk, Spencer Street, Hanover Street, Bank Street, you feel safe, you feel welcome, you feel accessible. So that's what that's good.
But isn't it part of zoning or site plan review? I'm not an expert at this stuff by any means. That you can provide certain concessions in various elements in return for, you said, landscape improvements and things like that. I don't think of landscape improvements when I think of providing better access ways to take advantage of the river without falling into it.
Throwing garbage in.
Or throwing garbage. That's
Go a long ways.
I fish bags of kitty litter out into the scope of my expenses.
Okay, so one more comment. I want to be respectful of your time and get us out before 8. One more.
I just wanted to say that as having been on the planning board now for 3 great years, one of the things I keep hoping to see is a developer coming to us saying, I want to open my little section of the river. I want people to sit in front of it like this, or even a tiny version of this, and just look at how beautiful this river is. If we had one project that did that, I can imagine everyone else
sets the standard.
Yeah.
Right, everyone else would fall in line. But I despair of seeing one. I haven't seen anything that even gets close to that.
What I fear is the white elephant. In other words, the minimum standards that are in that code allow the white elephant to show up at your door. In other words, it's the building in which everybody's arguing about whether the architectural style is right, but it's really a box.
It's really a what? Sorry.
It's really a box. Whatever
Box.
I mean,
Right.
it's a white elephant in the sense that it sits there, and from then on, that's the standard.
Yeah, that's what we don't want.
That's what we don't
want. We have to avoid that, because then there's no imagination going forward, taking up that particular place. But, when you see a project that takes a space that you really do not think has any future as it is, and they try and do something imaginative and creative, and it's got all kinds of, potential great ideas, but we're at stage 1. That's where I get excited, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is your property, this is your project, your vision, but don't stop. Just keep going forward, because this won't happen in my lifetime otherwise. Nor will other improvements in the rest part of the city that are hovering on the brink of development. So you just have to keep pushing.
Then why not have green space requirements, even of the standard individual residents? I'm not quite so worried. I'm more worried about the big buildings.
Big buildings.
Right. 15 feet to me is not a green space. 15 feet to me is a straight line like a bowling alley. And, that doesn't draw people into downtown. But green space does. It's fun to walk here. It gives room when a person wants to open up a cafe, put chairs out on outside. But it doesn't happen when the big white elephant shows up. Then it's over.
Which is
my worry.
I think that's a really gets back to the reason why we're pushing this forward, right? Is that right now you can open in a drive-through or vehicle sales or all open in downtown.
I really like, by the way.
And so, on that closing note, it's been really great to have this level of detail, like the input, and honestly the points on vision, right? And how we make sure we're not just covering the content of, we want to change the rules to avoid bad outcomes, but want to use this as a chance to advance some of that broader visioning. And I want to say thank you to everybody. So.
Thank you again for everybody. If you didn't sign in, please do, so that we can keep you informed as this effort moves forward. Thank you again.
No, it's on QD, but it's not.
Yeah, so, right.
It's not.